Now, moving in therefore on into the area of intellectual property, could you describe broadly the differences between the way in which intellectual property is managed in in a Western economy and the way it's managed in China, certainly from a policy and programs perspective?
Yeah, the IP question or the IP discussion. The China is part of the WTO, and because of the WTO membership, that there are very specific things that China does that needs to be in accordance to global rules, and that is done. Meaning the processes and how you go about registering. But there was one thing that was very clear that China will play along with the IP rules globally, but it will challenge the sort of the norm in terms of this global registration, in the sense that if you register something in China, it is deemed to be valid. Meaning that the most famous case was the name Jordan, Air Jordan, right? The Michael Jordan, Air Jordan. Some squatter decided that before Nike got into China, have woken up from the realization that IP is a major thing in China 20 years ago, that somebody just went and squatted. And how do you deal with that? Well, finally, after many years of court haranguing, that they said, well, this does belong to Michael Jordan. So I'm sure Michael's very happy about that. But it is about the progression of how data is shared. Okay, that's the way I look at it. Is the fact that when you have different systems in a different governmental environment, that you can have the same process of registration for your intellectual property, but the guidance and the way that the government manages the registrations and review them is quite different. And then we have the enforcement side, which is the legal side. Well, local rules will dictate. And if you're a foreign company that has a grievance, then you need to find out who's infringing on your IP. But the reforms in China, the big reform I think for IP is last year, 2018, where the government came down with some very new rules in terms of to further align with global standards. And that means that they're doing a shorter review period, easier to register online, and then the validation. So there were more, within the last 5 years, there were more foreign entities or individuals registering their IPs in China. Now, in that standpoint, I think that we're starting to sort of be aligned in terms of what's recognized as IP globally. But then, if there are infringement, this is where we get into some real major issues. Is that the amount of time it takes an individual company to file grievance against another to enforce his IP. Now, there are various ways that people are doing this. There's a cottage industry of investigators, private investigating companies. The most famous, I think, back from the Wild Wild West was the Pinkerton. Pinkerton is still
Sure.
around, and that's just one company that goes out and look and find evidence of IP infringement. Then they take it to the local Business Enforcement Bureau, and they allowed the Chinese entity, the governmental entities, enforcers, to go and look at the infringements. And this has been going on for ages. This has happened with software, with Microsoft, with, I would say if you've been in China for a long time, that you probably more likely ran across a copy of Windows that's not a real product. Basically, it was copied and pirated and used on a computer. But that's getting better. I think that because the software makers are getting very smart about the pricing. China is still I think developing in terms of the average wages, so they're pricing their products according to local economies. So there is no difference in terms of registration. Now, the first rights is basically a timestamp, right? You register early, but more likely you're going to have to do, if you're in China, you're going to have to do global registration. You can't just do in China. For the rest of the world, if you're in your home country, you would need to cover China rather than leaving it to a single entity to help you from globalized environment for the registration. So it's getting better. I think that the sort of the discussion, the negotiations between the U.S. and China is about IP infringement. The fact that if you're a foreign entity going to do business in China, will local laws protect your assets, intellectual property assets, and that's a tough one because there's validation of paperwork. And there's a tremendous amount of, I think, preparation that needs to be done. But most of the time, if you do have a grievance, you take it to local IP court. It will go in, but the idea is that you would need to prove the fact that somebody's infringing, and that takes a lot of time and effort. Now, if you're a small company, that will take up a whole lot of time. But if you're a big corporation, you have lawyers and so forth. I think it's a little easier. So we would love to see a more streamlined process to help the early startups to try to make sure that their IP is protected.